Manufacturing under Trump right now appears to be in a nosedive. Here's some facts that we've just gotten in the last couple days to indicate just what the state of American manufacturing is right now. Quoting from an article in Salon, the U.S. Manufacturing Purchasing Managers Index, so these are purchasing managers who work in American manufacturing, fell to its lowest level in April since October 2016 under President Obama. That's according to the Institute for Supply Management, those noted communists over at the Institute for Supply Management. The same survey also found that its factory employment index had fallen by 11% since October 2016. Factory output fell to its lowest point since August 2016. That's according to Reuters. Another survey found that May was the, quote, toughest month in nearly 10 years for American manufacturers. And it's a really good article I'm quoting from on Salon that pulls together a lot of this new data that we have talking about the state of American manufacturing right now. And the reason is obvious, but it's also not obvious. I'm going to do obvious first, and then we'll get to not obvious. One of these surveys allow for people who work in manufacturing, purchasing managers, and so on, to give an explanation. So they talk about what is the reason for you cutting back, whether it's cutting back on hiring, cutting back on manufacturing, cutting back on investments in future manufacturing. Quote, newly increased tariffs on Chinese imports pose an issue on a number of chemicals and materials that are solely produced in China. End quote. Another quote, the threat of additional tariffs has forced a change in our supply chain strategy. We are shifting business from China to Mexico, which will not increase the number of U.S. jobs. Now, there's a word in that last quote which is especially important and gets to the sort of unexplained aspect of this. It's the threat of additional tariffs. It's not the tariffs that are supposed to kick in this month on Mexico. It's the possibility of additional tariffs, right? And it's that volatility of not knowing where the next tariffs will hit that make it very difficult for people who run America's manufacturing firms to decide how much of my widget X should I be making in August, and therefore how many of widget X makers do I need to hire in July, right? So these all have domino effects, not just because of the tariffs, but because of not knowing where the tariffs will come. And there are two pieces of that that are uniquely Trumpian. So that they go beyond just the imposition of tariffs. That's why it's more than just this tariff on Mexico, that tariff on China, right? And there are two aspects of unpredictability that are specifically Trumpian that I want to talk about. One is, where are these tariffs going to hit? Manufacturers don't know, right? Because, for instance, Trump is talking about using emergency powers to levy tariffs on Mexico. Those emergency powers have never been used for tariff purposes on an ally. So there's no way of using precedent. Manufacturers can't look at the American policy precedents to say, oh, when the situation is X, then the government typically imposes tariffs Y, so I can make my hiring and my output decisions based on that. So the unpredictability on that level has everyone sort of operating at a worst case scenario because they don't know if that scenario is going to come to pass. And there's another aspect of uniquely Trumpian unpredictability that is hurting American manufacturing right now. And that's the volatility of process. And you find this with regulatory change as well. Manufacturers and industry at large, companies, Wall Street, all of them hate regulation, but they're not always necessarily even fans of deregulation. Why? Because it's change, right? It's the ability to plan. If they know what the regulations are and they have some assumption that the regulations will stay that way, they can plan around that. It's having to adjust all the time, over and over. So if you go back around the time of Dodd-Frank, you'll actually see that some people, after Dodd-Frank was imposed, was passed into law, you had some people on Wall Street not pushing for reform because they had already figured out, here's how we operate within these new rules. And they didn't want the change again. With Trump, the normal processes for tariffs are totally blown up. So if I'm a factory, I used to be able to say, oh, I see that there's this proposed tariff working its way through a regulatory or maybe not judicial, but a legislative, some sort of pipeline, right? Where stakeholders get to have some input and they get to gauge how the process is going, and they can gradually recalibrate how they do things in order to accommodate that. Not anymore. Now it's, I had a bad day, boom, you've got a tariff. And again, so everyone's got to scale back to that worst case scenario because there's no leading indicators of whether that scenario will come to pass. So what we're seeing right now is a relatively sharp and potentially devastating dip in American manufacturing based not just on the existence of tariffs, but uncertainty about where and on which products they're going to be levied, and also on how, and the absence of process. And there's one other element of all this that I want to talk to you guys about in our next video.